All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep, and I mean deep, into something that might seem a little, well, niche at first. We're talking about starting a deer processing business.
Yeah, deer processing.
It might not be the first thing that pops into your head when you think entrepreneurship, but trust me, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. It ties together, the whole world of business, the hunting culture, which is huge in many parts of the country, and some pretty serious skills.
Practical skills, for sure.
So we're going to unpack all that today. And our guide for this journey, for this deep dive, is this really comprehensive guide from SBK.
Yeah, they've really done their homework, haven't they? This guide goes from A to Z. I mean, it covers the initial planning stages, the legal stuff, all the permits and licenses, and even marketing, how to get customers in the door.
Yeah, it really does. It's the ultimate guide. So what we're aiming for today is to give you the essential information, the need-to-knows. Whether you're seriously thinking about opening a deer processing business, or maybe you're a hunter and you're thinking, hey, I could do more of this myself, or even if you're just curious about how this whole industry works, something you don't hear about every day.
The behind the scenes.
Exactly. We want to give you a solid understanding and maybe even surprise you with a few things along the way.
Speaking of surprises.
Oh, I got one. Buckle up for this. Did you know that Texas, just Texas alone, has an estimated 5.3 million white-tailed deer? That's more than any other state in the U.S. If you're thinking about this business, that number right there, that gives you a sense of the market potential.
And it's not just a random number, is it? That many deer, well, that means a lot of people are hunting, right? And that means a consistent need for processing all that, well, venison. The guide points out that you've got states like Mississippi, South Carolina. They may not have Texas-level numbers, but they still have a ton of deer and a strong hunting tradition, which means there are local business opportunities. And it's not just about how many deer, you can look at how much deer processors make in these areas. That gives you a real idea of the business viability.
Yeah, that's smart. So let's dig deeper into this whole demand thing, because it's not just your basic cuts of meat anymore, is it? The guide talks about a growing demand for, like, specialty products. What's going on there?
It's really interesting. People want more than just, steak and burger. They're looking for venison jerky, sausages, you name it.
Fancy,
A little
yeah.
fancy, yeah. And I think it's part of this trend towards healthier eating, right? High protein, less fat, and venison fits that bill perfectly. So for a deer processing business, this is a chance to really expand, offer more than just the standard processing.
Make more money, too. And here's something that I found really interesting. More and more hunters, they're actually processing their own deer at home. You'd think that would hurt the professional processors, but the guide actually sees it differently.
Yeah, and it's a really smart point. This DIY trend, it actually creates a whole new market, right? People need tools, equipment, they need know-how, like those deer butchering guides.
Instructions.
Exactly. So a smart business, they could actually cater to both sides, offer processing services, but also sell the tools and the knowledge.
I like it. It's like, teach a person to fish, but you're also selling the fishing rods.
Exactly.
Now, earlier you mentioned regulations, and the guide really stresses how important those are.
Oh, absolutely. They even specifically mentioned Texas and South Carolina, and it's a huge deal for anyone starting out. Things are getting stricter, sanitary standards, tracking where the meat comes from, it all matters.
Traceability.
Yeah, traceability. It impacts how your facility's set up, how you run things day to day. You can't just, work out of your garage. You got to know the rules and follow them.
It's not just about avoiding a fine. It's about running a legitimate business.
Right.
One that people can trust. Now, the guide also talks about a few other things that are shaping the industry.
Well, it's fascinating how technology is playing a bigger and bigger role, even in something as traditional as deer processing. Streamlining your operations, whether it's inventory management or quality control, those things can really give you a competitive edge.
Especially in a business where safety and consistency are so important.
Absolutely. Consumers are also becoming much more conscious about their food, where it comes from, how it's handled.
Like ethically sourced, all that.
Yeah, exactly. And the guide picks up on this. There's a growing demand for sustainability, for humane practices. If you can show that you're doing things the right way, treating the animals with respect, that's a big selling point for a lot of customers.
And that ties into the whole local and organic trend, doesn't it? Like farm to table, but for venison.
It absolutely does. It's just like any other food product. If you can offer locally sourced, organic deer processing, you're tapping into a market that's willing to pay a premium for that.
Smart. Okay, so we've talked about the market, but let's get into the nitty-gritty. Someone wants to start this business. What are the basic business models they need to understand?
The guide lays out two main models, custom exempt and USDA inspected. Custom exempt, that's basically processing for individual hunters. They bring you their deer, you process it for them, and they take it home to eat.
For personal use.
Right. And the regulations are usually less stringent for this kind of operation. Then there's the USDA inspected model. That's a whole other ballgame.
Sounds more serious.
It is the big step up. It means you can sell the processed meat more broadly, maybe even across state lines. But that means you're under the USDA's microscope, and that means stricter regulations, more costs to meet those standards.
So right off the bat, you're making a choice about how big you want to go. Now let's talk money. The guide breaks down the potential startup costs, and wow, there's a big range.
Yeah, and that really highlights why you need a good business plan. Just the facility itself, that could cost you anywhere from $26,500 to $119,000. That's a huge difference. It depends on whether you're renovating, building new, how big your refrigeration needs are, even your ventilation system.
And that's just the building. Then you've
Yeah.
got all the equipment. Knives, saws, grinders, slicers. The guide says that's another $1,800 to over $6,400.
Yeah, you need some serious tools.
No kidding. And then to process and package the meat, cutting tables, vacuum sealers, label printers, add another $2,200 to $7,500 for that. And we can't forget cleaning supplies. That's another expense, $550 to $1,800.
You got to keep things clean. That's a top priority.
Absolutely. And what about transportation? If you're picking up deer or delivering meat, you might need a special vehicle, maybe refrigerated.
The guide estimates that could be anywhere from $15,000 to $75,000. Big range there. And then there's the office stuff. Computer, software, point-of-sale system.
Basic business stuff.
Yeah, that's another $900 to $3,800. And then those little things, hoists to lift deer, scales, it adds up. The guide estimates the total startup cost could be anywhere from, get this, $47,000 to over $214,000.
So you need to know what you're getting into financially. But there's this interesting point about the market for the meat processing equipment itself.
Yeah, the guide mentions this prediction of a 4.5% compound annual growth rate, that's CAGR, for this type of equipment. So the demand is there, and it's expected to grow.
Which might mean, down the line, that some of that equipment becomes more affordable. Now, what about the money coming in? What do customers pay, and what can a business potentially earn?
Well, the average cost to get a deer processed, it can be anywhere from $75 to over $200. It depends on what the customer wants. Are they just getting basic cuts, or do they want sausage, jerky, all the fancy stuff? That, of course, impacts the processor's profits. And the guide says, in terms of annual revenue, you could be looking at tens of thousands of dollars, maybe even over 100,000, depending on your scale and what you offer.
Makes sense. And it all circles back to those deer populations, the hunting activity. More hunters means more potential customers. So you've got your market figured out, the costs. Now you got to set up the business. Where do you even begin?
Well, location is crucial. You can't just open up shop anywhere. The guide talks about zoning laws. You need to be in an area where commercial food processing is allowed. And you need enough space, storage, room to grow.
So many things to think about. And what about how you structure the business itself? The guide recommends a specific type.
Yeah, it points to the LLC, limited liability company. It protects the owners, If the business gets sued or goes into debt, your personal assets are generally protected. Plus, LLCs give you flexibility with taxes and how you distribute profits.
That's really important, especially in a business with some inherent risks, right?
Absolutely. Now, what about those smaller home-based operations?
Yeah, the guide mentioned those.
Right. Starting at home might seem cheaper, but it's not that simple. Zoning laws are even more important in residential areas, and health and safety regulations, those are non-negotiable. Proper refrigeration, a hygienic workspace, waste disposal, you gotta have it all. And you need all the right permits, too. Running a food business from home, it takes serious management skills.
And maybe some good relationships with your neighbors.
Probably helps. Okay, so we've got the location, the structure. Let's talk tools. The guide lists a bunch of equipment. Let's break it down.
Let's start with the basics. Knives, a bone saw, those seem pretty fundamental.
They are. Sharp knives are so important, not just for clean cuts, which affects the quality of the meat, but for safety, too. And a good bone saw, maybe a manual one for smaller operations, or a bandsaw for bigger ones, it's crucial.
For those tougher cuts. Then you have grinding, making sausage. The guide says a meat grinder is a must-have.
Absolutely. You need it to make ground venison, which is so versatile. The guide recommends going for a commercial-grade grinder, especially if you're processing a lot of deer. They're more durable and they'll last longer.
And if you're making sausage, you need a sausage stuffer. Makes sense. Now, to keep the meat fresh, the The guide recommends vacuum sealers.
They're essential. They preserve the freshness, prevent freezer burn, extend the shelf life. The guide even talks about the different types. Chamber vacuum sealers, which are more heavy duty, and the external suction style ones. It depends on your needs and your budget.
Now, for those specialty products, like jerky, you need some specialized equipment for that, right?
Right. A food dehydrator is key for making jerky. And then there's this thing called a jerky shooter. It helps you form the ground meat into nice, even strips, makes the process faster, and you get a more consistent product.
And for those perfect slices of jerky or roast, a meat slicer comes in handy.
It's not strictly necessary, maybe if you're super small scale, but it gives you a level of precision that's hard to do by hand. It makes your products look better, more professional.
Makes sense. The guide also mentions some of the less glamorous but important stuff. Coolers, butcher kits, meat lugs.
You know, those are the things that keep the operation running smoothly. Coolers for chilling the meat, butcher kits to keep all your hand tools organized, and meat lugs for handling the meat safely and hygienically.
And of course, you need a good digital scale for accurate measurements.
Can't forget that. Especially for recipes like sausage where you need precise amounts of seasoning. It's all about consistency.
And then there's this piece of equipment that sounds really cool, a freeze-dry machine.
It is cool, but it's a bigger investment. But the guide says it can extend the shelf life of your products like crazy. Freeze-dried venison could be a real niche product, something special.
Something to think about. So when it comes to equipment, it sounds like you need to balance the upfront costs with the long-term needs of the business.
Exactly. Invest in quality, even if it costs more at first. The guide suggests starting with the essentials, then add more specialized equipment as you grow and figure out what you really need.
Good advice. Now let's talk about quality and safety. How do you make sure the meat is handled properly?
The guide emphasizes proper meat storage. Ideally, you want to keep the meat between 0 degrees C and 2 degrees C to maintain the flavor and the moisture. And good air circulation in your coolers is important too.
Keep everything consistent. And for packaging, it sounds like vacuum sealing is the way to go.
Yeah, it's the best way to prevent spoilage and freezer burn.
Now, the guide mentions a resource at opentextbc.ca for more detailed procedures, but we won't get into that here. It's good to know those resources are out there. Now, the actual processing, that's governed by a lot of regulations, right? SOPs, SSOPs, HACCP. What are all these acronyms?
They're all about food safety, making sure everything's done right. SOP, that stands for Standard Operating Procedure. It's basically a step-by-step guide for how to do specific tasks safely and consistently. Then you have SSOP, Sanitation Standard Operating Procedure. That's all about keeping the processing environment clean and preventing contamination. And HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points, that's a whole system for identifying and controlling potential hazards, from the raw meat to the finished product.
So it's all about having clear procedures and focusing on safety, preventing anything from contaminating the meat. Now let's move on to the legal stuff. State regulations, federal regulations, licenses, permits, it seems complicated.
It can be, but it's crucial to understand it. The guide points out that deer processing laws, they're different in every state. They use Texas and South Carolina as examples.
So you need to know the rules in your specific state.
Absolutely. These laws cover everything from sanitation to licensing. Even the deer butchering guides that local wildlife agencies put out, those can have useful information about compliance.
So step one is to figure out what your state requires, and then there's the federal level.
Yeah, if you want to sell your product across state lines or export it, then the USDA gets involved. You'll need to comply with the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which means USDA inspections, meeting their standards for sanitation, humane handling, product safety. It's serious business.
And the guide talks about Minnesota's Equal to USDA inspection program. What's that about?
That's interesting. It's for businesses that operate only within Minnesota. They have a state-level inspection that's considered equivalent to the federal standards. So they can sell their products within the state, but they're still being inspected regularly, like a federally inspected facility. That's a good option for smaller businesses.
So, depending on your business model, you might be dealing with state regulations, federal regulations, or both. And continuous inspection, that's a requirement if you want to sell to retail stores, right?
Whether it's a federal inspection or a state equal to program, if you want to supply grocery stores or other retailers, you generally need that ongoing inspection. It gives them and their customers confidence that you meet food safety standards.
Now, besides the specific meat processing licenses, what other permits might a deer processing business need?
There are a few others. Federally, if you're importing or exporting anything, you'll need to check with the USDA. If you're selling alcohol, like pairing suggestions or something, you'll need permits from the TTB and your local alcohol beverage control board.
Makes sense. And what about state and local permits?
The guide uses Texas as an example. In Texas, the Department of State Health Services handles licenses for food manufacturing, wholesaling, and distribution. For meat and poultry, there's a specific meat safety assurance unit. And your local health department might have their own requirements for retail food, plus specific rules for milk and dairy products if you're dealing with those.
Sounds like a lot to keep track of.
It is, which is why the guide stresses starting early. They suggest 4 to 8 weeks to get all your licenses and permits sorted out, and it's always best to contact the agencies directly, get the most up-to-date information.
Do your homework. All right, so you're all set up, you're legal. Now you need customers. Marketing. The guide has some ideas about that too.
Yeah, it talks about your unique selling propositions. What makes you different? Do you specialize in something specific? Do you have special packages for at-home processors?
Find your niche. And then it dives into specific marketing strategies. Social media seems like a no-brainer these days.
Absolutely. Facebook, Instagram, those are great platforms to show off your work, get customer testimonials, connect with the local hunting community, show people what you do.
And don't underestimate the power of good old-fashioned community engagement.
Yeah. Go to hunting events, sponsor competitions, maybe even offer workshops on deer processing. Get your name out there, build relationships.
Network.
Network, exactly. And referral discounts, those are great for word-of-mouth marketing.
Yeah, encourage people to tell their friends. And a professional website, that's a must-have, right?
Definitely. It's your online storefront. List your services, pricing, testimonials. Make it easy for people to book your services. And don't be afraid to collaborate with other businesses.
Like hunting stores, outfitters.
Exactly. You can promote each other, reach a wider audience. And email marketing, that's still effective for staying in touch with customers, building loyalty.
Keep them coming back. So it sounds like focusing on quality, good service, and any unique services you offer. That's really the foundation of a successful marketing strategy.
You got it. Happy customers, that's the best advertising. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the practicalities of the business, but let's come back to the money. The guide talks about funding options.
Yeah, because that initial investment, that can be a hurdle.
It can be. And the guide reminds us to really know our costs so we can set competitive prices and make a profit. So how do you get that startup capital?
That's the million-dollar question.
Well, there are a few options. There are traditional small business loans from banks and credit unions. You might find grants specifically for agriculture or small businesses from the government or nonprofits.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Crowdfunding's becoming popular. Platforms like Kickstarter, GoFundMe. You can raise money and gauge interest in your idea at the same time. Personal savings are an option, but that's risky, putting your own money on the line. You could look for angel investors, people who invest in startups. They might provide funding and advice.
Mentorship.
Exactly. And there are government programs. The USDA has some for meat processing facilities.
So a lot of different avenues to explore. But you need to do your research, figure out what works best for you.
Absolutely. The guide emphasizes the importance of budgeting, knowing how much you'll need for equipment, the facility, licensing. It can add up quickly. You also need to know your competition, their prices, the demand in your area.
Sounds like you need a really solid business plan. Now, the guide ends with some key takeaways presented as frequently asked questions. Let's go through a few of those just to recap. What about the income? How much can a deer processor expect to earn?
The guide says the average hourly pay is around $24.67. But it really depends on where you are, how much you process, what services you offer. They emphasize that you can earn good money during hunting season, especially in areas with a lot of deer.
That makes sense. Now, what are the absolute must-have items, the bare essentials, for processing a deer?
Sharp knives, a bone saw, a meat grinder. You need a clean workspace, a sturdy cutting board, meat hooks, a scale for weighing, packaging supplies. And of course, you need to know how to butcher a deer, understand the anatomy.
The actual...
The skills, yeah. The guide also highlights those market trends we talked about. The growing demand for specialty products, the fact that more hunters are processing their own deer, those are key things to consider.
And it stresses the importance of following the rules.
Compliance is key. State laws, like in Mississippi, Texas, South Carolina, you have to know them and follow them.
No cutting corners.
No cutting corners. And lastly, it recaps the essential equipment. Whether you're a commercial operation or working from home, you need those basic tools. Good knives, a saw, a grinder, packaging supplies.
So it seems like starting a deer processing business, It's more than just knowing how to butcher a deer. You need business smarts, you need to know the regulations, and you need to know how to reach your customers.
Absolutely. But for someone who's in the right market, who's passionate about it, there's real potential, especially with people wanting local, ethically sourced food. There's a market for that.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. Think about this. With its growing interest in local food and all these deer out there, what other niche food businesses could be successful in your area? What local resources, what traditions could be the starting point for something new?
It makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.